So welcome to Notes 4.2, Policies of the Early Cold War for Ms. Richardson and Mr. Culhane's class. So we're going to look at some of the early policies of the Cold War. The biggest one is really containment. Containment is kind of an overarching policy that all these other smaller pieces fit into. So containment maybe is more of an idea than a policy. So the idea of containment comes from, so here's our containment, comes from the idea that the Soviet Union believed that communism was going to triumph and take over. And so the U.S. Believed that the Soviets thought we couldn't have a happy coexistence of the socialist and capitalist worlds, which meant that we needed to stop communism because otherwise capitalism, which we believed in, would fall. So here you can kind of see, we believed that the Soviet Union was trying to spread out into other areas. And if you look at China, Vietnam, Cuba, those are all places that you've probably heard of and know as communist places. Afghanistan, in the 80s, we actually had some things that happened in Afghanistan because we were worried about it. Western Europe, and even we were afraid it would come into the US. So we felt we needed to stop communism or contain it. And so that's the idea. Containment is about containing communism, keeping it where it already is. So there were two ideas the US really thought. We already had lost Eastern Europe and other areas to communism. Places that were already communist got to stay communist. The US, however, would resist Soviet attempts to form communist governments anywhere else in the world. So the idea behind containment is we keep it where it's at, we don't let it spread. So we have a couple of policies that fit under this big umbrella idea of containment. The first is the Marshall Plan, named after Secretary of State George Marshall, who came up with the plan. It's in post-World War II Europe. So after World War II in Europe, we see a lot of struggling countries, a lot of countries that were devastated by the war because the war was fought in Europe. So we want to see this we want to help them. We don't want them to become communist and be attracted to that. So basically, the U.S. will aid any and all European countries who need it. So it's not directed at any country, but we're trying to stop poverty, hunger, desperation, and chaos. We end up giving 16 countries $12.5 billion. So we're giving money to these countries so that they can develop their agriculture, they can develop their industry, and recover from the war. The Soviet Union actually qualified under this. We saw them as being too poor. We would give them money. They refused money from us. So the Marshall Plan, as you can see, based on this, you can see we gave lots of money in Western Europe to countries. We offered it to Soviet Union and to some other countries that turned it down because the Soviet Union controlled their governments, but we did offer the money. The next policy we want to look at is the Truman Doctrine. The Truman Doctrine comes from President Truman. Truman believed the U.S. needed to stop communist governments from spreading to where they didn't exist. Same thing as containment. But the Soviet Union was attempting to expand their sphere of influence, so they wanted to influence more areas, specifically Turkey. So this is all about Turkey and actually Greece. So the Soviet Union wants to have a warm water port, so they're trying to go further south. So Soviet Union south, Turkey's right here, and we actually have Greece over here. So the Soviet Union wants to have access so they can go through here to the Mediterranean and the Aegean Seas. That should not have become a straight line. So that's what we're looking at. President Truman wants to stop that from happening. So the Soviet Union starts to pressure Turkey. They want more control in Turkey. Turkey wants to resist, but they really need money. So Great Britain was helping them, but then Great Britain can't afford to anymore, so the U.S. takes over and sends money to not only Turkey, but also Greece to keep them from becoming communist. So under Truman and the Truman Doctrine, we spend $660 million keeping Turkey and Greece from falling to communism and pushing that idea of containment. So here you actually see the money we sent to Greece, the money we sent to Turkey. The Berlin crisis is not a policy. Our policy comes later, but you have to understand the Berlin crisis to understand this next policy. So we know about Germany being 4 zones. We know about Berlin being 4 zones. That's kind of the basis here. So we understand that. We've talked about that in class. So here we have a map, and you can see the 4 zones. and then the 4 zones of Berlin. Berlin's right here. So as you can see, in order to get into Berlin, the US, Great Britain, and the French had to go through the Soviet territory. Now, that's kind of an issue. Not a huge issue, but a small bit of an issue. As long as we're getting along, it's fine. But, as you know, we're not always going to get along. In 1948, the US, Great Britain, and France are going to combine their territory. We actually create a new country called West Germany. So the Soviet area becomes known as East Germany. So instead of having one Germany, we actually have 2 different countries of Germany, West and East. Berlin, the capital city of both countries, is in the middle of East Germany. So you can see this is a little strange. Doesn't work out quite as well. The Soviets feel kind of threatened because now West Germany is bigger, and so they want to punish the alliance. So they cut off Berlin from the other 3 countries. The other 3 countries cannot get into West Berlin. So they can't supply the area. This whole cutting off Berlin from the rest is called the Berlin Blockade. So the Berlin Blockade is when Berlin gets cut off, West Berlin gets cut off from West Germany by the Soviets to punish the other 3 for uniting against them. So here we see you have the bear that represents the Soviets, and he's cut off Berlin from everyone else. You can't get in without his permission. Well, in June of 1948, the US and their allies create a plan to stop West Berlin from being cut off, because they know if they're cut off, eventually they'll fall to communism, be part of East Germany because of the space. So they start the Berlin Airlift. They use airplanes to drop thousands of pounds of food and supplies into West Berlin. They actually use the planes and parachutes and fly over, constantly dropping food and supplies. Keeps the people supplied, keeps them supporting capitalism, keeps them on their side. So communism never spreads. Roughly a year later, 1949, the blockade ends. That doesn't mean the tension is going to go away, but it does mean that we don't have to continue the supplies. So here you can see the supplies going in, and then the planes would come back. Supplies going in, planes would come back. And this was constant for almost a year. Here you see this planes lined up, and they would just take off one after the other and go and drop that food and supplies into West Berlin. And here are some people cheering when the supplies got dropped. So as I said, the tension does not disappear. In fact, in 1961, the Berlin Wall is built. So it's going to continue, it's going to escalate, but we kind of look at the Berlin Airlift, our policy with saving Berlin and stopping communism from spreading into West Berlin, as a success because the blockade ended. So our final 2 pieces are NATO and the Warsaw Pact. So we see all this tension in Europe, we see the problems, and Truman decides we need to unite against communism with other countries that are like us. So NATO is the North Atlantic Treaty Organization that says that we will have a peacetime alliance with other countries that believe with us, want to be capitalist and democratic. Truman and Churchill developed this together. 10 countries to start, but it adds more over time. Says if one member is attacked, the others will aid that country. So it's all about peace. We're not going to attack anybody together. And this slide's not so good, so I'm going to skip over that. So the Soviets are not included in NATO because it's against communism. Then we add West Germany to NATO in 1955. So it borders communist-controlled countries. They now have a military. We allow them to be a part of NATO. It threatens Soviet peace and safety. So the Soviets feel very uncomfortable and they feel threatened. They respond by creating the Warsaw Pact, which is an alliance of communist countries that promise to support one another if they're attacked. So all of these satellite nations join the Warsaw Pact. The Warsaw Pact is essentially the same thing as NATO, just with communist countries. So here you have the NATO countries. We'll circle them. And then you have the communist countries, and they are all members of the Warsaw Pact. So you can really see the divide in the country, in the Europe now as you look at that. So now you want to get out your study guide, you want to look over it, and you want to make sure your notes align with your study guide. We will see you in class.